Welcome back to International NCRP. I'm quite excited with the community we have here. I think most of you have heard by this point that at least two of you are doing their best to join me when I teach a class on culture and peace in Bethlehem, West Bank in November. And the rest of you are welcome, if you want, to be doing research of however you want to frame this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the American Israeli-Arab conflict. You are welcome to join us from a distance by making this the case study that you study for this class. Of course, you're also welcome to pick whatever is of most interest to you. I would like to tell you about a new exciting opportunity that just entered my life yesterday. I have been approached by the publisher of this book, which is on Syria. It's written by a German diplomat who lived and did his diplomacy in Syria for a decade. And he writes quite intelligently about all the lost opportunities with the international community, the traditional community that we discussed last week, diplomats, heads of state. What's exciting is the publisher has just asked me if, based on a book review that I did of this book, if I would consider writing a new book. And this book would be in dialogue, optimally in dialogue with Syrian leaders, talking about how NCRP could be integrated into the rebuilding process to create a new multicultural democratic future for Syria. Now, those of you who are acquainted with the tragedy of Syria in the last years, and I can't imagine any of you have missed it, are going to realize that this is a very daunting task. But what is exciting for me is that there is a publisher who is very aware of Syria's, both its strengths and its weaknesses, who is excited about educating himself about NCRP and what civil society can do, rather than relying on the traditional levels that I critiqued last week. Like most weeks, I will be relying on a PowerPoint to introduce concepts and practices to you. So we are now going to turn to the PowerPoint for the rest of my lecture this week. What I will be focused on this week is beginning to introduce to you what I call in my PowerPoint true facilitative skilled mediation rather than manipulative mediation. And in short, I am introducing how NCRP, as you have studied NCRP, is being used throughout the world by primarily civil society, though occasionally diplomats and heads of states are part of the process as well, thank God. But as I say here, they are using this so that the international community can deeply understand their situations, their capacity, their strengths, and respond to and empower them rather than abandoning complex peoples. I would say that is a wonderful description for Syrian community as well as any other international conflict around the world. Let me go to the next slide. Now, most of you know that conflict management is not resolution. I am considered an expert in both, and I'm going to try to quickly introduce the differences to you. Now, many of you have taken alternative dispute resolution, so you're quite aware of the quasi-legal methods that organizations, communities, governments use to manage conflict. Normally, they are using top-down power with superior force, if we are talking about our courts and arbitration panel. There's a variety of possibilities here. Or, as we discussed last week, they manipulate with inducements. And so in a negotiation, an informal negotiation or a mediation with the government might be offering some quite enticing ways to persuade the parties in conflict to abandon their conflict, to reach some kind of resolution. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, it's a win-win, mutually beneficial resolution. It's a efficient way of managing or getting rid of the conflict. Now, this is where we often see evaluative expertise. So a mediator, arbitrator, let's talk about our retired judges or our longtime trial attorneys. They will come in and they will present their expertise and try to persuade or pressure the parties to reach a decision. This happens routinely at the peace building table around the world. Many of the people who call themselves international mediators, including those working with the United Nations, are scholars, academics, experts who believe they know better than the communities in conflict, and they're trying to tell them what to do. Now, I sound very critical and cynical about this approach, but actually it does have its place. It's just not going to be the focus of our course, since in NCRP, you are truly learning how to facilitate, how to negotiate a win-win, mutually beneficial, voluntary process where party self-determination is the fundamental premise. So rather than having you lead the process, the parties in conflict are leading the process. This is quite a radical idea. Now, I do not have time to have you read an article that I recently wrote with one of our NCRP alumni who is in environmental planning. But we wrote and published a chapter in my most recent book. It's available in the library electronically, in which we discuss climate change and climate change negotiations. Resolution, and all you learn is in NCRP, is definitely not happening in those processes today. But our alumni, Jill is one of the people I've worked with most closely. Myself, we are trying to introduce NCRP to the climate change negotiation process. Now, you are not reading Lori Nathan in this course. I think my book, Negotiation Alchemy, and the other assigned text are the best books that I have discovered that talk about facilitative, interactive processes that emphasize grassroots community. But Lori Nathan is one of the United Nations mediation panel or council. And so I am going to briefly describe what he talks about in his scholarship. He is a South African academic. You can Google him and you'll discover his articles. He's been involved in negotiating the Sudan conflict and other very serious African conflicts. Unfortunately, he comes from traditional international relations and an authoritarian historic past. And so he does not understand the difference between conflict management or resolution. I hope to meet him at some point and discuss this because I don't fault him. It reflects our international relations community today. He still talks about games theory and predictive power as something a mediator needs to use in order to persuade or pressure parties in conflict to reach some agreement. I would argue this is conflict management, and that I have actually approached our NCRP alumni who's working with the African Union to encourage him to hire NCRP alumni as mediators. We have several from African nations, so they can start to model facilitative resolution. Now, once again, I'm not including this in your reading. I'll introduce it to you. The Carter Center, Jimmy Carter Center, is seen as an international mediator. And I love Jimmy Carter. You know, he's up there with Pope Francis in my view of good human beings. And I think the Camp David Accords were genuinely win-win integrative bargaining. But sadly, if you study what Jimmy Carter has been doing in parts of the world, such as Venezuela, when Chavez asked him to come in and facilitate dialogue or mediation, and this included the United Nations, they were doing what I would call conflict management. Jimmy Carter was attempting to share his expertise as a former president of the major world nation-state power and tell Chavez what to do. He did not have the basic skills that you study in NCRP. Now, he did do some things that I would credit as resolution. He was invited by the president at the time of Venezuela. All parties agreed, so it was voluntary. And the third party had no quasi-legal leverage. Jimmy Carter and the other mediating bodies could not tell Venezuelans what to do. But at the same time, they used media to manipulate all the citizens. They were attempting to promote sort of what I would call a false peace building, a construction of how citizens were thinking. And they built peace building networks to depolarize the conflict, not through responding to interests and needs, but through some of the manipulation that I've already described. Now, I welcome any of you, if you want. Jimmy Carter's group has published a book on this particular process. It's very detailed. If any of you would like to study this and be in dialogue with me, I welcome other perspectives. Now, what I will say, not against Jimmy Carter or Lori Nathan or any of the current international mediators who are labeling themselves as international mediators, but trying to actually bridge these worlds, is that reframing is a key tool and skill. If you find yourself in an international negotiation, a complex multicultural negotiation or mediation, simply framing what you are hearing differently than these so-called mediators are doing would make a huge difference. And I'm going to start by saying, do not frame in the classic distributive dance, overly simplistic either or zero-sum game. Instead, frame collaboratively, connected to all parties, to generate options for mutual gain. If you are doing that in an international process, you are doing something that most of the world is yet familiarized with doing. You will be radically changing a process. You must include all parties and what you're seeing if you start to study. And the case studies that you see, not in my book, which is primarily grassroots, and I think it's pretty, the students involved in these processes and the colleagues are pretty knowledgeable about NCRP. But in the case studies in the other book, you may see that only a few parties were invited to the table. And that's a very powerful omission. When I was in India many years ago, and Burmese citizens were present talking about their repressive regime, they were arguing that simply being invited to the table, included in the conversation, would make them happy. And that is true with many international conflicts. At the moment, look at Syria. The world nation-state heads, leaders, representatives, Secretary of State and others are attempting to figure out what to do for the Syrian people. It is very rare that they are asked, what can we help you do to create your own future? And you certainly cannot just invite, the head of Syria and Putin, the head of Russia and head of Iran. You can't simply invite those who are directly polarized against each other. That choice is a failure more often than not is not surprising. And we learn things that, believe it or not, are very, very simple. Some of you would say common sense things, but at the international table, they could make a huge difference. You don't sit the people who are most polarized against each other across from each other. You learn that once you start to do real life mediations. If you want people to escalate and get stuck, sit them right across from each other. Instead, you ask them to talk to you, the mediator, and this can really transform dynamics. Now, most of you know this. This is a review. I'm quickly going to show you some of what goes on at the international table, which I will call distributive bargaining, and compare it with what you learn in NCRP, integrative. You know, the distributive dance, and there are zero-sum conflicts that we face in the world today. Water is one of the most troubling it might be the most troubling we are going to face. Climate changes, I would argue, is not zero-sum. There are many possibilities here, but water is, you know, we have to divide it, we have to share it. And so many people are going to be demanding, and the wealthiest are already starting to demand that they receive more than the poor. If you look at Southern California, you have, I can't remember the name of the horrendous movie stars who have been secretly stealing more water for themselves while the average person goes without. It's already starting. Now in the distributive dance, you try to compromise or split the pie. I'm using Harvard negotiation language. And the dance is, you make a demand, the other makes a demand, somebody gives a little, the other gives a little. It's quite a predictable dance till you reach a middle point that you can agree on. Now you all know that is not integrative win-win bargaining. And I'm introducing some of the skills you learn in NCRP that can really help the international stage. Now, fortunately, there are enough people. I think Harvard Negotiation Project, despite all the critique around the world, has had great influence. And there are more people at the international table, whether it's political, trade, economic, environmental, who understand the difference between these approaches and who are skilled enough in both that they're able to negotiate quality agreements that last. You are going to find many case studies where international negotiators have combined these two and done created a strong, sustainable negotiation agreement. These are all skills, and I'm not going to read the slides for you. These are all skills that you have used and learned in NCRP that you will not find. You will not find that often at the international table. Now, interest analysis is likely not explicit. I would say it's implicit. But aside from interest analysis, you are not going to find much of what you learn in NCRP. A masterful mediator has many tools, many skills, and I hope you know that from enrolling in our program. And we specialize in responding to what I will call non-rational dynamics, where emotions are heated, where people aren't thinking straight. You know, non-rational is actually an offensive term to use at the international level because rational is normally equated with culture. And so the predominant culture at the table, the dominant culture, such as the West, tends to see itself in an elitist way as the rational actor, while the global South and everyone else is irrational. So I suggest you not use it outside of this class, but I think it helps convey my point. Facilitative skilled mediation. Now, you can use logical argument, and sometimes, especially if lawyers are involved, you will hear logical argument, but more often than not, it will be careful listening for accurate and deep understanding. And as a Palestinian lawyer said to me, the first Arab prosecutor in Israel, she said, "We are emotional people. You cannot expect us to do this in a calm, step-by-step way after all the horrendous tragedy that we have experienced as a people." So we must be able to do it in the face of deeply held emotions and meaning. We must truly take the time to understand not just what the party is telling us, but the context of their emotion, of their passion. And then we empower parties to figure out how they're going to solve their own problems and live with each other themselves. We don't try to tell them what to do. We don't try to predict. Games theory will never predict what cultures are going to do, because generations will always shift the culture in subtle and sometimes dramatic ways. So we're not static people. We cannot be manipulated like a math formula. Now, Western human beings, and I hope you've studied this in theories of conflict, especially Americans have been studied, and these are predominantly white males. I would say white females have been part of the studies for the last 10, 20 years, I hope. But they're certainly not inclusive samples of human subjects. The ones who have been studied are predominantly privileged people, and no surprise, they have a self-serving bias. And I'll include myself in that group. We do not generally see ourselves as others see us. We tend to blame others. Think George Bush with the axis of evil. We see others' faults very clearly. We misjudge. We don't understand other cultures. We excuse ourselves very quickly, and we justify our actions. And is it a surprise? This slide is worth reading to emphasize we can be our own worst enemies again and again through our trained incapacities and projection. If you've taken ethics with me, you've read some of Carl Jung's work, we tend to see our own weakness in the other. So I would, if I had former President George Bush here today, I would say to him, that axis of evil, do you think there was some projection there? It was the American military that then went on to invade Iraq with no documented weapons of mass destruction, and to intervene in Afghanistan, and in many militaries' commentary, really fail and not succeed. Do you think we might have been projecting some of our own capacity for evil and injustice on others? Now, let me switch over. I know several of you have served in the military. The US military, you might be currently serving. And my son is currently serving. My husband is a retired colonel, so I don't want you to misunderstand what I just said. Those of you who are in dialogue with me will say they understand very well what I'm trying to say, and they do not take that as a statement against those serving in our military. Let me switch over to Venezuela. Chavez, all of you, you don't need to read this. You knew his reputation. He actually was a retired colonel too, who stood for the poor. He was provocative. He was a very difficult man at times. He encouraged confrontation and violence because he saw the elite of Venezuela as neglecting and forgetting, exploiting the poor. So there's a genuine question about whether the mediation that the Jimmy Carter Center did was in good or bad faith. Was he simply using mediation the way some of our transnational corporations and other powerful players do to look good, to appease his enemies? Was he really there to mediate, negotiate? There are some serious questions. Now, in Venezuela, with this case study, and you do not need to study it, but I'll give you some examples here of how I expect you to analyze your own real-world case studies. Here are some of the options that Jimmy Carter and the other mediators did not explore that they could have. They could have tried to have smaller confidential meetings, caucusing to explore trust building between the parties. There were many things that could not be said openly with all of the parties present. If you know the history there at all, there was a very strong elite group that was trying to oust Chavez. So they were not trusting him, they were attacking and trying to destroy. So these meetings would have been critical to explore possibilities. And then starting with small steps, what I teach in negotiation tactics with agenda setting, the easiest areas for agreement, building blocks, would have made a huge difference. Now, I have studied this case study intimately. I just returned from Brazil. It was quite timely and of interest to my students there. In this case study, there was a genuine question about whether the mediators had bias towards the parties. And I've already talked to you about rational from a cultural perspective. Some of the language that the mediators used, including Jimmy Carter, who I adore, and I quote, assuming more or less and somewhat coherent strategies. Now that is another version of rational. In law school, we studied the reasonable man, and you can imagine, since my law school class was the first to invite women in equal numbers to men, and this was only 30 years ago, that the reasonable man was a controversial and offensive term. Coherent is an offensive term. Who is to judge? Is the West to judge? Should Venezuela, govern itself from a US perspective, a Brazilian Latin perspective? These are some of the important questions. Now, anytime you do your real-world case study and you do an in-depth interest position analysis and identify common ground, I'm giving you generous credit. And you have already studied this in negotiation tactics. Please go back to your notes. If you took my class, use the Harvard Negotiation Workbook and go step by step. In fact, come back to my PowerPoint and use this to show me your NCRP skill. Now, anytime you ask the question, where would the international, or where should the international community seek skillful mediators, I'm going to give you credit. That's one of the important questions. And when I was in Brazil, I was asking what nation state or what nation state representative would Brazil trust? And who would trust Brazil as a mediator? Now, Brazilians will tell you no one at this point in time. I would suggest the United Nations and its regional bodies are hindered by bureaucracy and power abuse. I have worked very closely and done research with their internal mediators and professional conflict resolvers. And I have learned how much they take on corruption and power abuse. So these are really important fundamental questions. Now, my own ancestors' country of birth is often the answer for who would Brazil and other nation states trust as its mediator. And the answer is Brazil. Brazil would trust Norway, as did the Middle East, as had many nation states. In the future, I hope to address some of the reasons that Norway is trusted while no one else is not. Have a great week.